They called her the nurse who flinched at loud noises, the one who spilled trays in the break room and forgot chart numbers under pressure, the one Dr. Harlan Voss publicly mocked during rounds while the rest of the staff looked away. Nobody at Crestline Medical Center in Derville, Montana, knew what was stitched beneath the collar of her scrubs, a scar that ran 4 inches along her left trapezius, the kind only a combat knife leaves behind. Her name was Mara Sutton. And the morning a special operations convoy rolled into the hospital parking lot, everything everyone believed about her was about to be destroyed. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because what happens inside Crestline Medical Center over the next few hours is going to change every single person in that building, and not one of them saw it coming. The morning started the way most mornings started at Crestline Medical Center, with Dr. Harlan Voss making someone feel small before he'd finished his first coffee. It was 6:42 a.m. Mara Sutton was restocking the supply cart outside Trauma Bay 2 when she heard his voice cutting through the hallway behind her, loud enough to be intentional, aimed at the cluster of residents trailing behind him like ducklings. "Notice the cart placement," Voss said. "Right in the middle of a high-traffic corridor. Classic Sutton. Zero spatial awareness, zero situational thinking. She's been here 8 months, and she still can't figure out how to not be in the way." Mara didn't stop what she was doing. She kept counting wound packs, moving her lips slightly. 1, 2, 3, pressing each package into the tray with the same flat focus she brought to everything. Her hands didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't tighten visibly. The only thing that shifted was something small and internal, a quiet compression behind her sternum that she'd learned years ago to treat like background noise. One of the residents, a second-year named Torres, who sometimes made a point of being kind to her, shot a quick sideways glance her way. She didn't look up. She didn't need the sympathy, and she definitely didn't need Voss clocking the exchange and turning it into another demonstration. Voss moved on. His voice drifted down the corridor, already pivoting to something about imaging protocol, and the residents shuffled after him like they always did, eyes forward, no one saying anything. Mara finished the cart count, initialed the clipboard, and pushed the cart into the supply alcove. She stood there for a moment in the half-dark between the shelving units, one hand resting on the metal frame, breathing at a controlled pace, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, until the compression behind her sternum loosened enough to ignore. Then she walked back out into the hallway and started her shift. Crestline Medical Center was a Level 2 trauma facility serving Derville and the surrounding rural counties, which meant it saw everything from farm equipment injuries to complicated obstetric emergencies, with a steady flow of car accidents and hunting incidents layered in between. It was not a glamorous hospital. The floors were scuffed linoleum, the break room refrigerator had been broken for 6 weeks and counting, and the staffing numbers ran chronically thin across the night and weekend shifts. What it had was a tight crew of nurses and techs who mostly looked out for each other, a handful of solid attendings, and one department head who treated staff competence as a personal threat. Harlan Voss had been chief of emergency medicine at Crestline for 11 years. He was 54, broad-shouldered in a way that had probably been athletic once and now just read as physical weight, with a habit of standing slightly too close when he talked, and a voice calibrated to fill whatever room he was standing in. His reviews were mixed in ways that never quite resulted in formal action. Staff surveys full of vague, diplomatic language, a couple of HR complaints that had been quietly resolved, a general institutional tolerance of his behavior rooted in the fact that he brought in grant funding and had good relationships with the hospital board. He'd started on Mara within her first week. It had begun as small things, a pointed comment about her charting speed during a busy shift, a suggestion, delivered in front of 2 other nurses, that she might want to consider whether the emergency department was the right fit for her skill set. By month 3, the comments had become a pattern. Frequent enough to be recognized by the nursing staff, normalized enough that most of them had stopped reacting visibly, because reacting visibly made it worse. Mara had filed one internal complaint, early on, written and submitted through the proper channel. She'd received a response from hospital administration 3 weeks later, confirming that her concern had been reviewed and addressed, with no further details. Nothing changed. She'd filed no further complaints. What the staff saw was a quiet, slightly withdrawn nurse who kept her head down, did her work without complaint, and absorbed Voss's treatment with an expression that never gave him what he was actually looking for. What they'd decided, collectively and without much examination, was that she was fragile. Too fragile for the pace of emergency medicine, probably, but too stubborn to admit it. Nobody had ever asked her where she'd worked before Crestline. The answer was on her HR file, technically, but it was listed under a designation that most civilian administrators didn't know how to interpret. Fleet Medical Surgical Unit, Classified Deployment, 2011 to 2018. They'd read it as generic military nursing experience and moved on. What it actually represented was 7 years of field surgical work with special operations units across 3 combat theaters, including 2 deployments where she had operated as the senior medical officer for a Tier 1 reconnaissance element in conditions that had no official name and would never appear in any public record. The scar along her left trapezius was from a blade. The one along her right forearm, which she kept covered under her long-sleeved undershirt regardless of the season, was from a fragment. She had 2 others that were nobody's business. She had come to Crestline because it was small and quiet, and far from anything that reminded her of the years she'd spent building a version of herself she couldn't fully come back from. She had come to Crestline because she was trying, actively and with serious intention, to be a civilian. It was going moderately well, until mornings like this one. By 9 a.m., the ER was running at a pace that would be called steady by Crestline standards. 3 exam rooms occupied, 1 patient in imaging, a minor laceration waiting in the lobby with his wife, and a possible cardiac event being worked up in Bay 1. Mara was managing IV lines and coordinating with the pharmacy tech on a med reconciliation when her charge nurse, a 40-year-old named Deirdre Okafor, who had been at Crestline for 14 years and had the bureaucratic instincts of someone who'd survived multiple hospital administrations, found her at the nurse's station. "Heads up," Deirdre said, not looking up from her own clipboard. "We've got a notification from County. Military convoy incoming, some kind of scheduled medical visit or evaluation. 2 vehicles, ETA, about an hour. Voss wants the front corridor cleared and the conference room prepped." Mara processed this without reacting. "How many personnel?" Notification said between 6 and 10. They didn't specify the nature of the visit. Deirdre finally looked up. "You doing okay?" "Fine." "He was loud this morning." "He's always loud." Deirdre studied her for a moment with the specific expression of someone who had more to say and had made a calculation about whether to say it. She landed on not saying it. "Conference room setups on the board. Voss wants it done before 11. "I'll take it," Mara said. Deirdre nodded and moved off. Mara stood at the station for 1 more second, looking at nothing in particular, then picked up her supply list and went to work. She was arranging chairs in the conference room when she heard the first vehicle pull into the front lot. The conference room had a window that angled toward the main entrance, and she glanced through it without stopping what she was doing. A reflex, old and automatic, the kind of situational tracking that had been trained into her so thoroughly it no longer felt like a choice. 2 vehicles. Black, government plate SUVs, standard convoy spacing. The personnel who got out were in Army service uniform, and even from this distance she could read the composition, mix of officer and NCO ranks, 1 or 2 individuals with the particular kind of controlled low-footprint movement that didn't come from garrison service. Mara finished placing the last chair, aligned it with the others, and didn't look again. She was in the hallway outside the supply room 4 minutes later when the convoy came through the front doors, and what happened next unfolded in a sequence that she would later struggle to describe cleanly, because it moved fast and it moved in a direction she had absolutely not prepared for. There was a dog. She registered it at the same moment the handler did. A Belgian Malinois, medium build, working harness, clearly a trained military animal. And then the dog registered her. The shift was unmistakable. The animal had been moving in close heel formation with its handler, attention forward, a picture of trained discipline, and then something in the corridor caught its nose and its entire body language detonated. Not aggression. The opposite of aggression. The Malinois broke formation with a force that snapped its handler's arm back, And before anyone in the corridor could fully process what was happening, 70 pounds of military working dog was halfway down the hallway at a dead sprint, tail moving in a frantic low arc, and it hit Mara in the chest with its front paws and pressed its face into her neck and made a sound that was not a bark. It was something between a whine and a cry, high-pitched and sustained, the sound of an animal that had found something it had stopped believing it would find. Mara went completely still. Her hands came up and found the dog's head, and her fingers moved through its fur with the automatic certainty of muscle memory, behind the ears, along the jaw, and the dog pressed harder into her, shaking. The entire convoy had stopped. Every person in that hallway was looking at her. The handler, a young staff sergeant, maybe 25, clearly mortified, had jogged up behind the dog and was reaching for the leash with an apology already forming on his face. And Mara said quietly, without looking up from the dog, "What's his name?" The handler blinked. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. He doesn't do this. What's his name?" A pause. "Kodiak, ma'am." Her hands went still for 1 second. Then she pulled back enough to look at the dog's face, and the Malinois looked back at her with an intensity that was almost communicative, and she said very quietly, "Hey, buddy." The dog made the sound again. Behind her, she was distantly aware of the staff members who had gathered, nurses, a tech, 2 residents, all standing in the kind of frozen silence that follows something they don't have a category for. She was also aware, without turning around, that the senior officers in the convoy had gone very quiet in a different way, a way that felt like recognition. She stood up slowly, and the dog stayed pressed against her leg, and she looked at the handler and said, "He's okay. She stopped. Started again. "I know this dog." The senior officer was a colonel named Whitfield, Leonard Whitfield, according to the nameplate, a man in his late 50s with a face that had been weathered into something almost geological, deep lines bracketing his mouth, eyes that assessed everything in the room simultaneously. He had said nothing during the episode with the dog. He was still saying nothing now, standing near the entrance to the corridor, watching Mara with an expression she couldn't quite read and had stopped trying to. The visit, as Deirdre had been informed, was a routine evaluation, medical readiness consultation, Crestline being one of several rural facilities in the county, receiving assessment as part of a regional emergency response initiative. Colonel Whitfield and his team were here to walk the department, review protocols, meet with administration. Harlan Voss appeared from the direction of his office at 10 minutes past 10, moving with the particular velocity of a man who had received an important visitor and was intent on being perceived as someone equal to the importance. He was already introducing himself before he'd fully arrived, hand extended, voice at presentation volume. "Dr. Harlan Voss, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Colonel, welcome to Crestline. We're proud of what we've built here. I think you'll find we run a very tight operation." Whitfield shook his hand. His expression didn't change. "Thank you for having us." Voss was already gesturing, already pivoting into the tour, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had performed this particular scene many times. He guided the group through the department, pointing out equipment upgrades, staffing ratios, response time metrics, none of which were false exactly, but all of which were presented with a polish that smoothed over the understaffing, the broken refrigerator, the unresolved HR file sitting in a drawer somewhere. Mara moved through her regular duties, keeping clear of the group, and tried not to notice that Colonel Whitfield's eyes tracked her position in the room more than once. She was in Bay 3, changing a dressing on a farm worker's hand laceration, when she heard Voss behind her in the doorway. Not speaking to her, speaking about her, his voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to be heard without being seen to intend it. "That's Sutton, one of our more recent hires. Decent technical skills, but honestly, a poor fit for emergency pace. I've been managing the situation. Some people just don't have the instincts for this environment. You know what I mean?" The farm worker, a 60-year-old named Dale with a weathered face and excellent hearing, looked at Mara. She pressed the last strip of tape into place and said, "You're going to want to keep this dry for 48 hours, in a perfectly level voice." Whitfield said nothing in response to Voss. When Mara looked up as she was gathering the soiled dressing materials, the colonel was watching her with that same illegible expression, and there was something in it now that she recognized but refused to acknowledge. She broke eye contact and walked out of the bay. The situation changed at 11:23 a.m. It began with a sound that most people in the hospital mistook, for exactly 2 seconds, for something mechanical, a backfire, maybe, or equipment impact somewhere in the building. Mara was at the nurse's station. She had the sound categorized before the second echo finished. 2 shots. Small caliber, interior. The next 4 seconds were the particular kind of silence that exists before a building full of people finishes processing something catastrophic and begins responding to it. Mara used those 4 seconds. She was already moving when the first scream came from the direction of the main lobby. Not running, moving at a fast, controlled walk that ate distance efficiently. She hit the intercom at the nurse's station and pressed the emergency notification code, then pivoted to Deirdre, who had come out of the medication room with wide eyes and a phone already in her hand. Lock the east corridor doors. Activate the internal shelter protocol and get every ambulatory patient into the interior rooms now. Mara's voice was low and completely flat. Don't use the overhead system. It tells him where everyone is. Deirdre stared at her. Who? There's a shooter in the building. Do it right now, Deirdre. Something in her voice moved through the charge nurse like a current. Deirdre turned and started making calls. Mara pulled the crash cart away from the wall, exposing the emergency cabinet behind it. A regulatory requirement she'd noted and memorized on her 3rd day at Crestline, the kind of thing she filed away reflexively. Inside, emergency radio, wound supplies, a laminated facility map. She took the radio and the map. In the hallway, staff members were beginning to move in the scattered, uncertain way of people who understood something was wrong but hadn't been given direction. She stopped the first tech she saw. A young man named Reyes who was good under pressure. She'd noticed that about him. Reyes, take everyone in this corridor to the interior break room and lock the door. If anyone argues with you, tell them it's a lockdown drill. Go. He went. She was already reading the facility map against her memory of the building, building a picture. Entry points, sight lines, the interior corridor that connected the lobby to the east wing, the supply room that abutted the trauma bay with its shared ventilation panel. She'd mapped this building without deciding to map it, because she mapped every building she walked into, because that particular habit had been beaten into her by circumstances she preferred not to think about. She heard the colonel's voice before she saw him, around the corner of the east corridor, low and controlled, issuing instructions to 2 of his personnel. She came around the corner and he looked at her, and what crossed his face was not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. Sergeant Sutton, he said. She hadn't heard that in 4 years. It's still Sutton, she said. Where are your people positioned? He didn't miss a beat. 2 at the lobby entry, 1 at the south stairwell. We've got the shooter pinned at the junction of the main corridor and registration. He's not moving forward, but he's not isolated. He will move forward, she said. The junction gives him a view line to the trauma bay. He's going to want the trauma bay. She looked at the map in her hand, then folded it and put it in her pocket because she didn't need it anymore. What's Kodiak's current status? Handler has him secured in the east alcove. I need him. Whitfield looked at her for exactly half a second. Why? Because the shooter heard 2 sets of boots and a radio, and he's already counting personnel. He hasn't heard a dog. She paused. I can get close without engaging, but I need to know what I'm walking into first. The colonel looked at her for another moment. That same assessment, the one that hadn't changed since the lobby, the one that had been reading her this whole time. Then he said, Keen, and one of his personnel appeared from a doorway. Get her Kodiak. Mara was already moving toward the junction. Behind her, she heard Whitfield say something else. Quiet, to no one in particular, or maybe to himself. And she didn't catch all of it, just the last 4 words. Should have known she'd still be here. She didn't have time to think about what that meant. Down the corridor, 40 feet ahead, a shadow moved across the linoleum in the thin light coming through the registration windows. And Mara pressed herself against the wall and went completely still. And she watched the shadow, and she counted, and she breathed it 4 counts in and 4 counts out. and she waited for the dog. Kodiak arrived without sound. That was the first thing. The handler, Keen, had trained the animal well enough that even moving fast through a building on lockdown, the dog's paws hit the linoleum in near silence. His nails kept short, his breathing controlled. He came around the corner and found Mara pressed against the wall, and he went to her immediately, no hesitation, pressing his flank against her leg the way he'd done in the lobby, except quieter now, reading the environment, reading her. She put her hand on his back. Not a comfort gesture, a communication. She felt the animal's attention sharpen under her palm. "Good boy," she breathed. Barely sound at all. Down the corridor, the shadow hadn't moved. She could hear, at the edge of her perception, the particular quality of someone standing very still and trying to think. Not the stillness of a professional, but the stillness of someone who had run out of the next step and was standing in the gap between what they'd planned and what was actually happening. She knew that stillness. She'd encountered it in people who were dangerous precisely because they were no longer rational. She looked down at Kodiak. His nose was working, processing the corridor in strips, and his ears, those sharp, mobile ears, were angled forward and slightly left. Toward the junction, toward the alcove on the near side of registration where the shadow was originating. Left of center. Not at the junction itself, tucked into the alcove beside the vending machines. She filed that, adjusted her picture of the space, behind her quiet footsteps. Whitfield, moving up. He crouched beside her without being asked, which meant he'd done this kind of thing before, which she already knew but confirmed anyway. "Alcove left of the vending bank," she said. Not a question. He didn't ask how she knew. Confirmed. "My guy at the south entry can see partial. One shooter, male, appears to be alone. Handgun, not long rifle." "Has he made any demands?" "No, he fired twice, both into the ceiling. No injuries confirmed yet." Into the ceiling. She turned that over. Someone who fired into the ceiling in a crowded lobby was either trying to clear the room, functional, tactical, or trying to announce himself without committing to harm. The first type was controlled. The second type was unraveling. "He's not here to kill anyone," she said. Whitfield looked at her. "You can't know that." He fired twice into a ceiling full of people and then stopped moving. If he wanted casualties, he had them. She paused. "He's here for something else. Someone else." She felt more than saw Whitfield process that, and then set it aside for later the way experienced people did when the information was relevant but the immediate problem hadn't changed. "What do you need?" he asked. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. 60 seconds of quiet from your people. No radio traffic, no movement. I want him to hear nothing for 60 seconds, and then I want him to hear me. That's a significant risk. I know. Another pause. Then, 60 seconds. She looked down at Kodiak one more time. The dog looked back at her with an attention so complete it felt almost conversational. She gave him the hand signal for stay. Flat palm, low, and he dropped to a controlled sit against the baseboard, his eyes tracking her as she straightened up. She walked around the corner. Bottom. The corridor was empty and bright under the fluorescent overheads, and she walked down it at a normal pace, not fast, not slow, hands visible at her sides, and she said, at conversational volume, "I'm a nurse. I'm not armed, and I'm not trying to corner you. I'm just walking." Silence. She kept walking. 15 feet from the vending alcove, she stopped and stood in the middle of the corridor, fully visible, and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came from the alcove, young, male, rough-edged, with something that sounded less like anger and more like exhaustion, taken past the point of recovery. "Stop right there." "I stopped," she said. "I'll shoot." "I believe you," she said. "I also don't think you want to." A sound from the alcove, not quite a laugh, something adjacent and uglier. "You don't know what I want?" "No," she agreed. "That's why I came to ask." The silence stretched. She stood in it without moving, without looking away from the alcove entrance, and she breathed at 4 counts in and 4 counts out, and she waited because waiting was its own kind of pressure, and she understood how to use it. He came around the corner of the alcove with the gun at his side, not raised. She registered him in a single scan, Early 20s, civilian clothes, military cut hair grown out past regulation, the specific gauntness of someone who hadn't been eating or sleeping consistently for weeks. His eyes were red-rimmed and too bright, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who had walked this far on adrenaline and was only now beginning to register that he didn't know what came next. "Why are you not scared?" he asked. It came out like an accusation. "I am," she said. "I'm just not showing it." Something crossed his face. Confusion, maybe, or a kind of recognition. He looked at her properly for the first time. "You're the nurse." "From before. I saw you when we came in." "That's right. You were... They said something to you. That doctor." She kept her expression neutral. "What's your name?" A pause, then quietly, "Danner. Private First Class Garrett Danner." He said the rank automatically, the way people did when it was still part of how they thought of themselves. I'm not active anymore." "Okay, Garrett." She let his name sit there for a moment. "What are you doing here?" His jaw worked. "I need to talk to someone. I need to talk to the colonel." "Colonel Whitfield?" His eyes sharpened. "You know him." "He's here for a scheduled visit. He's in the building." She paused. "You could have walked in and asked to speak with him." "They wouldn't have let me. They don't... People like me don't get meetings. We get forms. We get referrals. We get told to call a number." His voice cracked on the last word, and he brought it back under control with visible effort. "My brother is dead. He died in a classified operation 14 months ago, and nobody will tell me anything. Nobody will even confirm it was real. His name isn't on anything. It's like he didn't exist." She heard it, the specific shape of that grief, the one that had nowhere to land because the thing it needed to land on had been officially erased. She'd seen it before, from the other side. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said. "Don't." His voice went hard. "Don't say that. Everybody says that, and then they stop talking." "Then I won't stop talking," she said. "Tell me his name." He looked at her for a long beat. Something in his face moved. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Danner." He was a ranger. He was 26. She kept him talking for 11 minutes. She learned that Marcus Danner had deployed on a classified joint operation the previous year, that Garrett had been notified of his death through a brief official call and a follow-up letter that contained no specifics, that every subsequent inquiry Garrett had made, to his brother's unit, to the Pentagon Survivor Liaison, to 2 different congressional offices, had been met with some variation of the same non-answer, that the non-answers had accumulated over 14 months into something that had finally broken through whatever restraint he'd been managing. He had not come to the hospital to hurt anyone. He had come because he knew the colonel was here, and he had run out of other doors to knock on. She did not tell him that things would be fine. She did not tell him the system would work. She told him that she heard him, and that what had been done to him was a failure. A genuine, institutional failure that he had not caused and that he deserved to be angry about. She told him that firing into a ceiling had made the next steps harder, and that she needed him to put the gun down, not because the police were coming, though they were, but because holding it was costing him the one thing he still had available to him, which was the moral clarity of a man who was right. She didn't know if that last part would land. It was a gamble. He put the gun on the floor and sat down against the vending machine with his face in his hands, and she walked forward and crouched in front of him, and she said quietly, "You did the right thing." He didn't answer. His shoulders were shaking. She stayed crouched in front of him until she heard the team moving up the corridor behind her. Whitfield's people, controlled and fast. And then she stood and turned and held up one hand, palm out, and said, at the same volume she'd used the whole time, "He's surrendering. He needs medical attention before anything else. Treat him like a patient." The 2 operators who had come around the corner exchanged a look. Then they looked at the colonel, who had come around the corner behind them. Whitfield looked at the young man on the floor. Then he looked at Mara. His expression had changed into something she still couldn't fully read, but it had weight behind it. "Get the medic," he said, to his people, not to her, but he was still looking at her when he said it. Sit. What happened next moved fast in the way that Aftermath always moved fast. Controlled chaos contracting into procedure, every person finding their role. The buildings held breath beginning to release in stages. The D'Urville police arrived at 11:47, 12 minutes after the situation resolved, and the coordination between Whitfield's team and the responding officers was smoother than it had any right to be, which meant someone had made calls that Mara wasn't aware of. She went back to work. That was the only way she knew how to handle transition, fill the space with something functional. The lockdown was lifting in phases, and she helped manage the patient flow as the sheltered individuals were moved back to their rooms or their waiting areas, checked on the farm worker with the hand laceration who had been locked in an exam room for 40 minutes and was not pleased about it, updated medication logs that had gotten behind during the disruption, and tried to be invisible. She was not invisible. She felt it in the way the staff moved around her. Not the usual movement, the one that involved giving her slightly too much space in the way people gave space to someone they pitied, but a different kind. A recalibration. She caught Reyes looking at her across the nurses' station with an expression she didn't have a clean category for. She caught Torres, the second-year resident, stopping in the middle of writing a chart, watching her walk past, and then looking quickly back down. She didn't address it. There was too much to do, and addressing it would require a conversation she didn't have the bandwidth for. Deirdre found her in the medication room at 12:15. "You want to tell me what that was?" Deirdre asked. "Managed a situation." "Mara." She looked up. Deirdre was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who was not going to accept a deflection. "I've done crisis negotiation before," Mara said. "It's a skill set." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Deirdre paused. "The colonel. He called you sergeant." Mara looked back at the medication cabinet. "He was mistaken." "He was not mistaken, and you know that too." She didn't answer. She finished the count she was doing and initialed the form and put it back in the slot, and she could feel Deirdre watching her the whole time with the specific patience of someone who had been a nurse for long enough to know that waiting was more effective than pushing. "I was in the military," Mara said finally. "A long time ago. It's not relevant to my work here." The colonel didn't seem to think it was irrelevant. "The colonel's opinion of my service record has nothing to do with my ability to do this job." A beat of silence. Then Deirdre said more quietly, "No one here thinks that. Thinks you can't do this job." Another pause. "Some of us have been trying to figure out how to say something for a while about the way things have been handled." Mara turned around. "Deirdre, I appreciate that, but right now I need to finish the post-incident patient checks, and I need you to let me do that." Deirdre held her gaze for another moment. Then she nodded and stepped back from the doorway, and Mara walked out into the corridor. She did not see Harlan Voss for the next 90 minutes. This was unusual. Voss was not someone who stayed out of the department during high-profile events, typically the opposite, and she had expected him to materialize during or immediately after the crisis with some way of centering himself in the resolution. His absence registered somewhere in her peripheral attention, and she filed it without examining it. At 1:45, she was in the break room for the first time since 6 a.m., standing at the counter with a cup of coffee she was mostly holding rather than drinking, and the door opened and Voss walked in. He looked different, not physically, the same broad shoulders, same presentation-ready posture, but something in the arrangement of his expression was off from his baseline. He saw her, and he stopped walking, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the break room with its buzzing overhead light and its broken refrigerator and the smell of the same coffee she was holding. "Sutton," he said. "Dr. Voss." He seemed to consider something. "I heard what you did, with the patient in the corridor." He made the same correction she'd made in her head. Patient, not shooter. It was deliberate, she thought. He was reaching for language that would make this a clinical conversation. "Situation was manageable," she said. "The colonel's people are saying—" He stopped, started again. "People are saying you talked him down." "The young man needed someone to listen to him. I listened." Voss was quiet for a moment. He walked to the coffee maker and poured a cup without looking at her, and she watched him do it and felt the strange flatness that had settled into her. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the particular tiredness of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and hadn't yet been able to put it down. "The colonel asked about you," Voss said, specifically. "He asked me how long you'd been on staff and what your background was." She waited. I told him what I knew. He paused, which was apparently not very much. No, she said. It wasn't. He turned around. Whatever he'd been organizing in his expression hadn't quite landed. It was somewhere between contrition and the habitual authority of a man who very rarely had to do contrition, and the combination made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncomfortable. That doesn't change how things have been handled here, he said, and she could hear him mean it as an acknowledgement, though he couldn't quite make it sound like one. No, she said again. It doesn't. She put her coffee cup down on the counter and walked out. Colonel Whitfield was in the administrator's conference room when one of his personnel found her at 2:15 and conveyed the request, not an order, specifically, the NCO was careful about that the colonel would appreciate a word when she had a moment. She had a moment. She followed him to the conference room. Whitfield was standing at the window when she came in, looking out at the parking lot with his hands clasped behind his back, and he turned when she entered with the easy economy of someone who had spent decades moving in spaces where every gesture had a function. "Close the door," he said. She did. He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't make it easy to find you." "I wasn't trying to be found." "I know." He moved from the window to the table but didn't sit, just rested his hands on the back of one of the chairs. 4 years, Mara. 4 years in a place like this. Under a man like that. "I chose this," she said. "It was a deliberate choice, and I don't want it framed as something that was done to me." He stopped. She could see him recalibrate. "Fair," he said, "but I need you to understand that the decision to classify your service record the way we did, the way I authorized, was made to protect you. And I'm aware that protection has costs." "It did what it was supposed to do," she said. "I'm not here to relitigate that." "Then what are you here for?" He said it without challenge, genuinely asking. She thought about it. "Right now? To finish my shift. To make sure my patients are stable. To check in on the young man in Corridor 3 who fired 2 rounds into a ceiling because no one would tell him what happened to his brother." Whitfield's expression shifted. "Danner. You know him?" "I know of him. The operation that killed Marcus Danner it's complicated. He's 22 years old, and he drove 14 hours and walked into a hospital with a gun because he had nowhere else to go," she said. "That's what complicated looks like from the outside." The colonel was quiet for a long moment. She could see him thinking, the specific calculation of a senior officer weighing classification against cost, policy against the thing in front of him. "I'll talk to him," Whitfield said. She hadn't expected that. She kept her expression neutral, but she hadn't expected it. "There are limits to what I can tell him," he added, "but there are things I can confirm. Things he deserves to hear from someone who isn't a form letter." "Yes," she said. "There are." He looked at her again. The full assessment, the one he'd been doing since the lobby, and now she could read what was underneath it. Not just recognition, something closer to regret for a specific kind of waste, the kind that institutions produced regularly and rarely acknowledged. "What are you doing here, Mara? Really?" She looked at him steadily. "I told you. You're pulling medication logs and managing supply carts for a man who doesn't know what he has in this department." He paused. "You neutralized a crisis today that my team, good people, well-trained people, had not managed to contain. You did it with a dog and a conversation." The dog helped. He almost smiled. Almost. "I'm not trying to pull you back into anything you don't want. I'm asking you what you need, because something brought you to this town and this hospital, and I don't think it was because you were done." She stood in that for a moment. The question had weight. Not the uncomfortable weight of something unwanted, but the heavier weight of something that was true and hadn't been said out loud in a very long time. "I needed it to be small for a while," she said finally. "I needed the stakes to be something I could see the edges of." "And now?" She didn't answer immediately. Through the conference room window, she could see the parking lot, the dark SUVs still parked at the far end, and beyond them the edge of Derville, the pharmacy, the feed store, the highway that ran north into country that was very large and very open. Now I think the stakes got larger again without my permission, she said. Whitfield held her gaze. Something in the room shifted. Nothing dramatic, just the particular settling of two people who had reached a point of honesty and were deciding what to do with it. Then his radio crackled. One of his personnel, voice tight in the way that meant something had changed. "Colonel, you need to hear this. We just got a transmission from the base security office. They're saying the incident here wasn't random. Someone flagged the convoy itinerary 2 days ago. This location was targeted." Mara went very still. Whitfield's hand was already on the radio. "Targeted by whom?" A pause on the other end, the static-edged hesitation of someone checking whether they had authorization to say what they were about to say. "Sir, there's a second individual, someone who came into the building before the convoy arrived. They've been inside the hospital this whole time." The word targeted sat in the room like something with mass. Mara moved first. She crossed to the conference room door, opened it, and looked both ways down the corridor with the automatic scan she'd been running all day. Not anxiety, pure information gathering, reading the flow of bodies and sight lines the way you read a room for exits. "How long ago did this come in?" she asked, not turning around. Whitfield was already on the radio. "Timestamp on the transmission." The voice crackled back. 14:03, sir. About 12 minutes ago." 12 minutes. She did the math without thinking about it. 12 minutes since the transmission, plus however long it had taken base security to flag, analyze, and push the information forward. The second individual had potentially been inside the building for hours. "Description," Whitfield said into the radio. "That's the problem, sir. We don't have one. The flag came from a signals intercept, not visual confirmation. Someone communicated the convoy's specific itinerary to a third party 48 hours ago. We don't know who received it or why." She turned back around. Whitfield was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just had his threat assessment revised and was not pleased about it. "The Danner situation," she said. "Was it real?" He understood immediately. "You're asking if he was a distraction." "I'm asking if someone knew that a distressed young man with a grievance and a handgun was going to walk into this hospital today and use that to pull your team's attention to the corridor while something else moved into position." The silence that followed was the kind that meant she'd said something that had already been forming in someone else's mind. "Keen," Whitfield said, and the operator appeared from the hallway with a speed that suggested he'd been standing very close to the door. "Full sweep, every room, every corridor, laundry, maintenance, basement, if there is one. I want eyes on every person in this building in the next 8 minutes. Go." Keen was already moving. Mara stepped fully into the hallway. "I know this building better than your people do." "Then you're with me," Whitfield said, and came through the door behind her. They moved fast and quiet through the east wing, Whitfield on her left, one of his remaining personnel, a compact woman named Specialist Rourke, who moved like someone who had trained for small spaces, on her right. Mara was running a mental grid of the building as she walked it, overlaying her 8 months of daily navigation against the tactical picture. Every room she'd been in, every corner she'd noted, every anomaly in the building's routine that she'd registered and filed away without specifically deciding to. The maintenance corridor that ran behind the East Wing's patient rooms had an access panel that she'd noticed 3 months ago had been rekeyed. New lock hardware on an old door, which meant someone had a reason to change who could get in. She'd made a note of it at the time in the vague way you noted things that weren't your problem. It was her problem now. "Maintenance access on the east wall," she said. "Mid-corridor. The lock was changed recently." Rourke peeled off toward it without being told. Whitfield kept pace with Mara. "You've been doing threat assessment on this building since you got here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do it everywhere," she said. "I can't turn it off." "Have you ever considered that maybe you shouldn't?" She didn't answer that. They reached the junction of the east and central corridors, and she stopped. The central corridor ran the length of the building, lobby on one end, the rear service entrance on the other, and right now it was operating under the partial lockdown she'd instituted during the Danner situation, which meant reduced foot traffic and most of the staff consolidated toward the nursing stations, which meant a large portion of the building was quieter than usual, which meant if someone was moving through it trying not to be noticed, now was the time. She heard it before she saw anything, a sound that didn't fit, Not loud, barely there. The specific soft impact of a door that had been eased closed rather than allowed to swing. Coming from the direction of the radiology wing, which was behind schedule on today's patient load because the technician had called in sick and they were running one machine short. She put her hand on Whitfield's arm without speaking and pointed. He looked at her, then at the direction she was pointing. Then he reached for his radio. She shook her head, pointed to her ear. He'd already understood. Radio traffic could be heard, and if someone was in the radiology wing trying to stay quiet, the sound of communications would push them into action. He lowered the radio. They went down the side corridor in single file, Mara first because she knew the layout, Whitfield behind her, and she was aware this was not how he would have arranged it if he'd had the choice. But he was disciplined enough not to argue in the middle of a move. The radiology wing had 3 rooms, the main imaging suite, a prep room, and a storage and equipment room at the far end. The imaging suite had a leaded glass window in its door. Mara reached the door, stopped to the side of it, and looked through the glass at an angle. Not straight on, angled, because straight on put your silhouette in the window, and she'd been taught that the first time around, and it had stayed. The imaging suite was empty. Prep room door was open, which was wrong. The prep room door was kept closed during non-use because of the climate-controlled storage for contrast media. It was a policy she'd helped Deirdre enforce twice in the last month. She put 2 fingers up, then pointed to the prep room door. Whitfield read it and moved to the opposite side of the hallway, giving them a split angle on anything that came through. She pushed the prep room door the rest of the way open with 1 foot, staying clear of the frame. Empty. But the climate alarm panel on the far wall was blinking. Door had been open long enough to trigger the temperature monitoring, which meant someone had been in here, and recently. She looked at the storage room door at the end of the corridor. Closed. No window. Whitfield was looking at it too. She held up a hand, thought for 3 seconds, and made a decision she knew he wasn't going to like. "I'm going to knock," she said very quietly. "Absolutely not. If they're armed and positioned, breaching that door hands us nothing. If I knock and they think it's staff, we have a second." She paused. "This is a hospital. People knock on doors." He looked at her for a moment with the controlled frustration of a man who recognized good tactical logic and hated it. "Stay to the side," he said. She moved to the side of the door and knocked twice, the way anyone would. Not a police knock, just a knock. And said, in a voice calibrated to carry just enough, "Maintenance check. Anyone in here?" 3 seconds of silence, then the door handle moved. What came through the door was not what she expected, and she was honest enough with herself afterward to acknowledge that. The person who opened the door was a woman, mid-40s, civilian clothes, dark hair pulled back, and the specific expression of someone who had been caught in the exact place they were trying not to be found. She had a camera in her hand, a professional one, mid-range, the kind journalists used, and she was already pulling credentials from her jacket pocket before the door was fully open, thrusting them toward Mara with the practiced urgency of someone who had been in this situation before. "Press," she said. "Investigative journalist. I'm not armed, I'm not a threat, and I know exactly how this looks." Whitfield came around the corner with the controlled speed of someone who had been prepared for a very different scenario, and the woman flinched but held her ground, keeping the credentials extended. "Nadia Varga," she said, "Montana Independent Courier. I've been inside this building since 9 a.m. Whitfield took the credentials, read them, looked at her. "You want to tell me why?" She looked at him, then at Mara, and made some kind of assessment. "I'm here because of the hospital," she said. "Not the convoy. The convoy was... I didn't know about the convoy." "What about the hospital?" Mara asked. Varga's eyes settled on her. "How long have you worked under Harlan Voss?" The answer, as it came out over the next 7 minutes in the prep room with Whitfield listening from the doorway and Rourke standing post in the corridor, was the kind of answer that recontextualized everything Mara had been living inside for 8 months. Nadia Varga had been investigating Harlan Voss for 11 weeks. She had sources, former staff members, most of whom had left Crestline quietly under the kinds of arrangements that came with non-disclosure language buried in severance agreements. She had documents, or partial documents, including what appeared to be falsified continuing education records and a set of performance reviews that had been altered retroactively to support the terminations of 3 nurses in the past 4 years. One of those nurses, a woman named Tessa Brandt, had been the previous holder of the supply coordinator position that had been given to Mara. Brandt had also filed a formal complaint, had also received a response describing the matter as reviewed and resolved, had also left the hospital within 6 weeks. Mara stood in the prep room and felt something cold and clear move through her. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular sensation of a picture coming into focus that you'd been looking at slightly blurred for a very long time. "What are you trying to publish?" she asked. "What I've already isn't enough," Varga said. "I need corroboration. I need someone inside the department, someone currently working there, who can speak to the pattern." She paused. "I've been trying to get access for 3 weeks. Today seemed like the right moment. The administrative staff is focused on the military visit, and I thought—" She stopped. "I didn't account for a shooter." "Nobody did," Mara said. "Are you going to have me removed?" Whitfield looked at Mara. That particular look again, the one that was asking a question without asking it. She looked at Varga. "How much do you have on the altered performance reviews?" "Enough to establish a pattern, not enough to prove who made the changes." "There's a digital access log," Mara said, "for the HR records system. Every entry and modification is time-stamped with a user credential. I know this because I helped Deirdre Okafor pull a records request 6 weeks ago, and she walked me through the system." She paused. "If the changes were made from inside the hospital, the log has them." Varga stared at her. "Can you access that?" "Not directly, but I know who can." She looked at Whitfield. "I need 10 minutes. The 10 minutes became 20 and then 30, because what should have been a straightforward conversation became something else entirely. Deirdre Okafor did not frighten easily. Mara knew this about her, had observed it in the particular steadiness she brought to difficult situations, the way she moved through chaos without losing the thread. But when Mara found her at the nurses' station and said quietly that she needed access to the HR records system for a specific purpose she would explain fully in a moment, Deirdre's face went through something complicated. "How long have you known?" Mara asked. "About Tessa?" A pause. "Since before you were hired." "And the others?" Deirdre looked at the desk surface for a moment. "Mara, I have 2 kids in high school and a mortgage. I know what that sounds like." "It sounds like someone who was scared," Mara said. "And I'm not saying that to judge you. I'm saying it because I need you to decide right now whether you're still scared or whether you're done being scared, because the window on this is not going to stay open." Deirdre looked up. Something in her face had shifted. Not resolved exactly, but moving in a direction. "What do you need?" she said. The HR system access log took 11 minutes to pull. It required Deirdre's credentials and a records request flagged under the hospital's internal audit protocol, which Deirdre initiated with her hands moving steadily over the keyboard the way they moved over everything, the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing this job for a very long time and knew every corner of its systems. What they found was both worse and cleaner than Mara had expected. The modifications to the 3 performance reviews had been made from a single user credential over a span of 4 months, at times that were outside normal business hours, twice after 10 p.m., once on a Sunday morning. The credential was Voss's administrative login. Deirdre printed it. Her hands didn't shake. Mara noticed that specifically. "I'm going to need to give this to someone," Mara said. "I know," Deirdre said. "You'll be named as the person who pulled the records." A pause. Shorter than Mara expected. "I know that too." She was walking back toward the conference room with the printed log in her hand when Reyes found her in the corridor, slightly out of breath from what looked like a jog from the other end of the building. "Sutton, Bay 1. He was working to keep his voice even. "We've got a problem." "What kind?" "One of the colonel's people, the one who was at the south stairwell, Corporal somebody, I didn't get the name. He took a fall on the exterior stairs about 20 minutes ago during the sweep. Nobody flagged it during the lockdown confusion. He's been down there." He paused. "He's got a head laceration and he's not tracking right." She was already moving past him. Bay 1 was set up for the cardiac workup that had been interrupted by the Danner situation and never fully resumed, which meant the monitoring equipment was already in place and the crash cart was nearby, which was the only thing that went right in the next 10 minutes. The operator, Corporal Weiss, according to the nameplate 28, built like someone who had spent years carrying weight in difficult terrain, was sitting on the exam table with his hand pressed to his left temple, and an expression of concentrated neutrality that Mara recognized immediately as someone trying very hard to perform fine and not quite succeeding. She moved to him without preamble. "What day is it?" she said. "Tuesday." "It's Wednesday. How many fingers?" She held up 3. 3. "Did you lose consciousness?" A pause. "Maybe. Briefly, I'm not. There was a period where I don't have a clear account." "How long ago did you fall?" "I don't know exactly. 25 minutes. She pulled on gloves and moved his hand away from the temple laceration, which was still actively bleeding. A 4-centimeter wound on the lateral aspect of his forehead, skin separated but not gaping, the bone beneath palpably intact when she ran 2 fingers along the margin. The blood had tracked down the side of his face and dried at his jaw, which told her it had been bleeding for at least 15 minutes without pressure. "I need a light," she said to Reyes, who was standing in the doorway. He brought the pen light from the supply drawer without being told where it was, which she noted with one part of her attention while the rest was focused on the pupils. Right was brisk, reactive, 4 millimeters. Left was 5 millimeters and slightly sluggish. She kept her expression controlled. "I need a head CT right now, and I need it ordered before I finish this sentence," she said, still steady. "Get me Dr. Parrish, not Voss, and get Torres in here with a suture kit." Reyes disappeared. She began applying pressure to the laceration with gauze, talking to Weiss in a continuous low voice, his name, the date, simple orientation questions, keeping him verbal because verbal meant conscious, and conscious meant she had time. But the pupil differential was telling her a story she needed the CT to confirm or refute, and she needed it now. "Am I going to be all right?" Weiss asked. He asked it the way soldiers asked things. Flat, not dramatic, just a direct request for information. "You have a head injury that needs imaging," she said. "I'm not going to tell you anything I don't know yet." "Fair," he said. She pressed the gauze firmer and felt him hold still without being asked. And she was aware, in the background of everything she was doing, that the printed log was still in her coat pocket, and that Whitfield was in the conference room waiting, and that somewhere in this building, Varga was sitting in a storage room with a camera and 11 weeks of documentation, and that Voss was somewhere in this hospital right now, not knowing that the ground under him had changed composition entirely. Torres arrived with the suture kit. She handed off the pressure gauze, gave him the pupil differential without editorializing, watched his face run through the same calculation hers had, and turned to confirm the CT order with the unit clerk through the doorway. That was when her radio, the emergency band radio she'd pulled from the cabinet during the Danner situation and had kept clipped to her waist since, crackled with a transmission that cut through every other frequency in the building. Not Whitfield's team. A different voice. Tight, controlled, the kind of controlled that meant the person was working very hard at it. "This is a message for the colonel. I know you're still in the building. I know what your convoy was carrying, and I want you to know that Corporal Weiss didn't fall down those stairs." The transmission cut off. The exam room went completely silent except for the steady beep of the cardiac monitor and the sound of Weiss's breathing. Mara looked at Weiss. He was looking back at her, and something in his expression had changed. Not fear. Something more specific. "Someone pushed you," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I didn't see who," he said. "It was fast, and I didn't want to—" He stopped. "I didn't want to compromise the sweep." She stood up from the exam stool and looked at Torres. "Do not leave this room. Do not let him leave this room. CT as soon as transport can move him, and you go with him." "Where are you going?" Torres asked. She was already through the door. The corridor outside Bay 1 was empty in the way that felt wrong. Not the normal afternoon lull, but something with intention behind it. A particular quality of absence that she'd learned to treat as information. She moved fast toward the conference room, radio in hand, running probability. Whoever had sent that transmission was inside the building, had been inside the building long enough to push Weiss down exterior stairs and then move back inside without being flagged by the sweep. Which meant they knew the sweep's pattern, which meant they had been watching Whitfield's people long enough to map the gaps, which meant they were good. That was the part that concerned her most, not the threat itself, the competence of it. She hit the conference room door and pushed through without knocking. Whitfield was already on his feet, radio in hand, face arranged into the particular stillness of a senior officer receiving very bad news and not letting it show completely. Rourke was beside him. They'd heard the transmission. Everyone on the emergency band had heard it. Weiss was pushed, she said. I gathered. He's in Bay 1. Torres is with him. I've ordered a CT for probable intracranial involvement. She was already moving to the table, pulling the floor plan from her memory, and sketching it on the legal pad that had been sitting unused on the conference table. Rough, fast, good enough. Your sweep moved east to west. It started at the lobby and pushed back. Anyone watching from the exterior or the upper floor could see the pattern. There is no upper floor. There's a mezzanine level above the imaging wing. It's used for building mechanicals, HVAC, electrical. Access is from the maintenance corridor. She looked at him. Rourke went to check the maintenance access door earlier. Rourke said, door was locked, no signs of entry. What about the roof access from the mezzanine level? A pause. I didn't have sightline to the roof hatch, Rourke said. The admission was clean, no defensiveness, just a fact about a gap. Mara looked at the sketch she'd made, then at Whitfield. Someone with exterior access and a radio could have come in through the roof, moved through the mezzanine, watched your sweep from above through the mechanical grates, identified the gap at the south stairwell, pushed Weiss, and come back up before anyone was in position to see them. Whitfield looked at the sketch, then at her. That's a significant level of preparation. Yes. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. This isn't random, and it isn't just about you. Someone knew the convoy itinerary. Someone was in position before the Danner situation started. That means they had at minimum 48 hours of lead time and enough intelligence to know the building layout. She paused. Who knew about this visit? The visit itself was in the scheduling system for 3 weeks. Medical readiness evaluations aren't classified. So anyone with access to military scheduling could have seen it. Or anyone with access to the hospital's administrative calendar, he said. We sent a confirmation to hospital administration. She looked at him. He looked at her. The same thought moving between them without being spoken. She said it anyway. Who received the confirmation on the hospital's end? Whitfield picked up his phone. Out. She left him to make the call because standing still made her useful to no one. And she had 2 things she needed to do before the situation compressed further. The first was Garrett Danner. He'd been moved to an exam room in the East Wing after Whitfield's people completed their initial assessment, technically under custody, but the logistics of that were being handled loosely in the way that happened when a situation outgrew its original shape and nobody had issued updated orders. She found him in exam room 4, sitting on the edge of the table with his wrists zip-tied in front of him. A field decision that had clearly been made by someone who was not Whitfield and had not been reversed yet, with a hospital blanket over his shoulders and a cup of water on the tray beside him that looked untouched. He looked up when she came in. He'd been crying at some point in the last hour and had stopped and was now in that specific flatness on the other side of it. They haven't told me anything, he said. A lot has happened. She pulled the rolling stool over and sat down, which put her slightly below his eye level, which was not accidental. Colonel Whitfield is going to talk to you. That's still happening. The situation got more complicated. Because of me, not because of you. She meant it. You were here for a legitimate reason, and you handled a weapon in a way that was illegal and dangerous, and I think you already know that. He looked at the floor. I didn't plan to hurt anyone. I know. She paused. Garrett, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. He looked up. Did anyone contact you before today? Anyone who knew you were planning to come here, or who suggested this location, or who gave you any information about the colonel's visit? His brow came together. No. I found out about the visit from a military scheduling update site. The kind that posts public appearances and regional evaluations. I've been tracking the colonel's schedule for 2 months. He stopped. Why? She watched his face. He was confused, and the confusion was genuine. The specific confusion of someone being asked a question that doesn't map onto their understanding of what they did. Okay, she said. That's helpful. What's going on? There's a second person in this building, someone who isn't you, and who had very different intentions. She stood up from the stool. The colonel will talk to you. Whatever happens after that, I'm going to ask him to make sure you're connected with someone who can actually address what happened to Marcus. Not a form letter. A person. He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. She thought about the answer. I know what it looks like when someone's been failed by every system that was supposed to help them and they don't have any moves left. She moved toward the door. I've been inside that myself. It's not a comfortable place. She pulled the door open. Behind her, he said quietly, Thank you. She walked out without answering because she wasn't good at that part, and also because she was running out of time. The second thing was Voss. She'd been avoiding the direct confrontation, not from fear of it, but because she'd wanted the documentation in order first, wanted the shape of what she knew to be solid before she stood in front of him with it. The log was still in her coat pocket. Varga was still in the storage room with her camera and her 11 weeks of reporting, and Mara had not yet told Varga about the access log, and she needed to make a decision about sequencing before someone else made it for her. She found Voss in his office. He was on the phone, but he ended the call when she appeared in the doorway, which told her he'd been expecting something. Not her specifically, but something, and had been bracing for it. She came in without being invited and closed the door. He looked at the closed door, then at her. His expression ran through several things quickly before settling on the professional distance he usually kept as a default. Sutton, I'm in the middle of, I need 2 minutes, she said. You can have more after, but I need 2 minutes first. Something in her voice made him stop. She could see him assess it. Not her, the voice. He'd been reading staff for 20 years and he was good at it. Good enough to hear when a register had changed. Fine, he said. She took the printed log from her pocket and put it on his desk. She didn't slide it toward him, just set it down in the center, face up. He looked at it without touching it. She watched him read the visible portion, the timestamps, the credential identifier, the record modification flags, and she watched his face move through something she had not seen on it before. Not guilt, not yet. Something anterior to guilt. Recognition. This is an HR audit log, he said. It's the access record for modifications made to 3 performance evaluations over the past 2 years. The credential on every entry is yours. He said nothing. Tessa Brandt's review was modified 11 months ago. The original language described her performance as exceeding standards. The modified version described repeated procedural errors. She kept her voice flat. Not cold. Flat. There are 2 others. He picked up the log. He read it properly this time, taking longer than he needed to, and she stood in front of his desk and let him read it. Where did you get this? He asked, finally. Through the hospital's audit protocol. It was a legitimate records pull. Who authorized it? She didn't answer that. He set the log down. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at her with the expression of a man reorganizing his understanding of a situation at speed. This doesn't look the way you think it looks, he said. Tell me how it looks. He opened his mouth, stopped, tried again. Performance documentation requires revision sometimes. When additional. At 10:40 on a Sunday morning, she said, using your personal login, 2 hours after you received notice that Tessa Brandt had formally requested a records review. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones, heavier. She picked the log up from his desk and put it back in her pocket. I'm not the one you need to explain this to, she said, but I'd suggest you start figuring out what you're going to say, because the conversation is coming regardless. She turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard his chair move, not standing up, just shifting, the sound of someone repositioning underweight. You've been here 8 months, he said. His voice had changed. Not smaller, exactly, but compressed. You walked in here, and I walked in here and did my job, she said at the door. That's all I did. She left. She was halfway down the corridor when her radio crackled with Whitfield's voice, and the tone of it stopped her mid-stride. "Sutton, where are you?" Not a question. She keyed the radio. "Central Corridor, East Side. Come to the administrator's office. Now." She came. The administrator's office was larger than the conference room and currently more crowded. Whitfield, Rourke, one of the Durville police officers who'd arrived post-Danner and apparently never fully left, and a man she didn't recognize in a jacket that read Law Enforcement Federal without having any specific marking. The man she didn't recognize looked at her when she came in with the specific assessment of someone who had been briefed on her before the meeting. "Agent Calloway," he said, by way of introduction, extending a hand. "Federal Investigative Bureau, Regional Office. I've been on the phone with your colonel for the last 20 minutes. He said your colonel with a slight inflection that suggested he understood the relationship was more complicated than the phrasing implied. She shook his hand. "What do you have?" "What we have is a positive identification on the second individual." He turned to the table where a laptop had been opened to a photograph. Surveillance image, slightly grainy, time-stamped from the hospital's external camera at 8:47 a.m. A figure entering through the building's side service entrance, face angled slightly down but visible enough. His name is Frederick Dalt, 41, former contractor, worked in logistics for 3 different defense-adjacent private firms over the past decade. He was terminated from the last one 14 months ago following an internal investigation into data access violations. "What kind of data?" Whitfield asked. She could tell he already knew. He was asking for the room. "Operational records, specifically records related to classified joint operations in the 14 to 18-month prior window." Calloway paused. "Including the operation during which Marcus Danner was killed." The room was quiet for a moment. "He has a connection to Danner," Mara said. "Not personal, professional, or near it. Dalt worked in a support capacity adjacent to the logistics chain that supplied that operation. When the internal investigation started, he would have had access to the investigation scope before the relevant records were pulled." "He knew what the operation was," she said, "and he knew it was being buried." "We believe so. We also believe he's been attempting to monetize that knowledge for the past year. 3 separate inquiries, different contact methods, targeting people or entities who might pay for information about classified operations." Calloway looked at Whitfield. "Your convoy was on his list. Not to expose the information, to sell proof of it." "To whom?" Rourke asked. "That's the part we're still developing." Mara looked at the photograph on the laptop. Dalt's face, mid-40s, nothing remarkable. The face of someone who had spent years being peripheral to important things and had decided at some point that proximity was leverage. "He's still in the building," she said. "We believe so." "The sweep didn't find him because he was watching the sweep from the mezzanine level." She looked at Calloway. "He's had all day to prepare a position. He knows the lockdown is lifting, and he knows federal presence arrived, which changes his options significantly." "He'll try to leave," Rourke said. "Or he'll try to make the situation worse before he does." She looked at the service entrance on the laptop image. "That's how he came in. It requires a key card or a code." "Staff access only," the police officer confirmed. "Who gave him the code?" she said. The question sat in the room. Whitfield looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at the police officer. The police officer looked at the administrator's door, which was closed, with an expression that meant someone had already asked this question and had an answer they hadn't shared with the room yet. "The code was accessed through the hospital's administrative system," Calloway said carefully. "We're still tracing the specific authorization." Mara looked at him. "Was it accessed from inside the hospital?" "Yes." "When?" 4 days ago." She felt the pieces land, not all at once, sequentially, the way evidence assembled when you'd been looking at a situation long enough to have most of the shape already built. 4 days ago. Before the convoy confirmation was sent to the hospital, before the scheduling notification went out. From inside the hospital's administrative system. "He had help," she said. "Someone on staff gave him the access code." Calloway nodded. One careful nod. "And the confirmation of the convoy's itinerary," she said. "Who on the hospital's administrative end received that confirmation?" The room was very quiet. The police officer opened his notebook, read from it. Confirmation email was received and opened by 2 accounts. The hospital administrator's general inbox. He paused. And the chief of emergency medicine. She stood in that for a moment. Not shocked. She'd been tracking toward this, but tracking toward something and arriving at it were different things, and the arrival had its own particular weight. "Voss," she said. "We don't have confirmation," Calloway started. "He was on the phone when I walked into his office 15 minutes ago, and he ended the call immediately." She looked at Whitfield. "He knew I had the HR log. I showed it to him, and his first question was who authorized the records pull, not what the records showed." She paused. "He was trying to find out how much we had and through whom." Whitfield was already moving toward the door. "Colonel," she said. He stopped. "He can't be approached by military personnel. You don't have jurisdiction inside this building for a civilian matter." She looked at Calloway. "Agent Calloway has jurisdiction, and I'd like to suggest that before you bring Voss in for a conversation, you check whether he's still in his office." Calloway was already on his phone. The answer came back in 40 seconds. Voss's office was empty. His car was still in the parking lot, and a staff member on the east corridor had seen him 3 minutes ago walking toward the maintenance wing, toward the maintenance corridor, toward the access panel that led to the mezzanine level. Mara looked at Whitfield. He looked at her. "He's not going to Dalt," she said, and she heard the certainty in her own voice, the kind that came from having enough of the picture to read what was missing. "He's going to make sure Dalt is not in a position to say anything about who helped him." The room moved all at once. She was through the door before any of them, radio already in hand, and behind her she could hear Calloway on his phone, and Rourke's boots on the floor, and Whitfield's voice issuing the specific kind of controlled, urgent directive that came from someone who had spent decades making bad situations stop getting worse. And somewhere ahead of her, in the maintenance corridor of a hospital where she'd spent 8 months being told she didn't belong, 2 men who had used people like currency were moving toward each other in the dark. The maintenance corridor was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of space that existed in every large building as an afterthought. Pipes along the ceiling, conduit runs stapled to the walls, the smell of insulation and old concrete. Mara moved through it fast, one hand trailing the left wall for spatial reference in the dimness, reading the sound ahead of her. She heard them before she saw anything. 2 voices. Not loud, the opposite of loud, the specific intensity of 2 men who were trying to have a confrontation without making noise, which gave it a compressed, pressurized quality that carried further than shouting would have. "Voss first. You said this was contained." Then another voice, tighter, younger in register, the voice from the radio transmission. "It was contained until your people started pulling HR records." "What did you tell them?" "I didn't tell them anything. Someone else pulled." "You gave me your access code. You confirmed the convoy schedule. Your name is on everything that matters. So if you're standing here thinking I'm the problem, you need to reconsider your math." She stopped moving, pressed herself against the left wall, 6 feet from the turn in the corridor where the voices were originating. Behind her, she could hear Calloway and Rourke moving up. She held her hand back in a flat stop gesture and felt them pull up short without having to look. "The federal agent," Voss said. His voice had changed register, lower, and with a quality she'd never heard from him before, something stripped of the performance overlay he wore everywhere in the hospital. "He was asking about the access code. He knows someone gave you entry." "Then the conversation you should be having is with your lawyer, not with me. I need those records removed. Whatever you pulled from this building, whatever you're planning to—" "I'm not planning anything anymore." Dalt's voice went flat. "Everything I came here for went sideways the moment that kid walked in with a gun. This stopped being a negotiation 4 hours ago." "Then what is it now?" "It's me figuring out how to walk out of this building and you figuring out how to make sure I have a reason to keep your name out of whatever comes next." Silence. The specific silence of an implicit threat landing. She turned the corner. They were standing in the wider section of the maintenance corridor where it abutted the mezzanine access ladder. Voss with his back partially to her, Dalt facing her and registering her presence in the same instant she registered his. He was medium height, carrying a duffel bag on one shoulder that had the weight of something substantial, and his eyes did the fast calculation of a man assessing threat. "Don't," she said. She said it the same way she'd said everything today, flat, certain, without heat. "There's a federal agent 12 feet behind me and 2 armed personnel behind him. The ladder goes to the mezzanine, and the mezzanine is a dead end." Dalt looked at the ladder, back at her. Something moved in its face. Not defeat, not yet, but the specific recalculation of someone whose last option just closed. Voss had turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. Complex in the way that faces went complex when several things collapsed simultaneously. "Sutton," he said. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Dalt. "Put the bag down," she said. For a long moment, nobody moved. The pipes above them ticked with thermal expansion, and the fluorescent at the far end of the corridor hummed its single sustained note, and Mara stood in the center of the space and waited with the same quality of patience she'd been deploying all day, the kind that had nothing passive in it. Dalt set the bag down. Calloway came around the corner. What followed was procedure, which was both less dramatic and more final than the moments that preceded it. Calloway made arrests the way federal agents made arrests, methodically, with the specific language of someone documenting each step for a record that would be read by people who had not been in the room. Dalt was handcuffed and walked out through the maintenance corridor and the east exit to a vehicle that had apparently materialized in the parking lot during the preceding 20 minutes. Voss was not handcuffed. He was asked, in language that was technically a request and functionally not, to accompany Agent Calloway to the administrator's office for a conversation. Mara watched Voss walk out ahead of the agent, and she felt unexpectedly very little. Not satisfaction, not the release she'd been half expecting, just a kind of settled quiet, the way weather felt after a front had passed. Not better or worse than before, simply different. Rourke appeared at her shoulder. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, because that was slightly too clean, "My hands are cold. They get cold when the adrenaline drops." Rourke looked at her hands and then back at her face with an expression that was professional courtesy resting on top of something that might have been respect. "There's coffee in the conference room," she said. "I have patients to check on." "There will always be patients to check on." That was true. She went and got the coffee. About. Corporal Weiss's CT came back at 4:17 p.m. showing a small epidural hematoma. Not large, not immediately surgical, but absolutely requiring monitoring and neurosurgical consultation, which meant a transfer to the regional Level 1 trauma center in Kalispell by early evening. Torres had ordered the transfer correctly, was managing it efficiently, and needed nothing from her except the chart notation she added in 2 sentences before she went back to the nurse's station. She checked on every other patient in the department, all stable. The farm worker with the hand laceration had been discharged 2 hours ago. His wife had, according to the unit clerk, been vocally unhappy about the wait time, which meant the world was operating normally in at least one respect. She found Deirdre at the nurse's station at 4:45, doing what Deirdre was always doing, managing 6 things simultaneously with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since stopped finding the volume surprising. "Weiss is transferring at 6, Mara said. "I know, Torres has it." Deirdre was not looking at her, which was deliberate. "I've been told there are federal agents in the administrator's office." "Yes." "And that Voss is in there with them." "Yes." Deirdre was quiet for a moment, still not looking up. "The records pull," she said. "They're going to ask me about it." "They will." "Is there anything I should know before they do?" Mara looked at the side of her face. The careful neutrality she was maintaining, the quality of someone who had been holding a difficult thing for a long time and was only now starting to feel the weight of putting it down. "Tell them exactly what you told me," Mara said, "and tell them about Tessa Brandt. All of it. Everything you know." She paused. "Deirdre, you didn't do anything wrong today." Deirdre's jaw moved. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't do enough before today." Mara didn't argue with that, because it was true. And Deirdre knew it was true, and offering comfort that papered over a real failure wasn't something either of them needed. "No," she said. "But you did enough today. That matters too." Deirdre finally looked at her. Her eyes were bright, not quite wet, the specific expression of someone holding things at the edge of their capacity. "I've watched him do this for 6 years," she said. "I kept thinking someone else was going to—" She stopped. "I kept waiting for someone else." "I know," Mara said. "Me too, for a while." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, at a nurse's station in a hospital that had been tilted sideways all day and was only now beginning to right itself, and there was no good way to mark the moment, so neither of them tried. "Go talk to the agent," Mara said. "I'll cover the station." Whitfield found her at 5:30. She was documenting in the small office behind the nurse's station, the one that was technically assigned to the charge nurse, but which everyone used because there was no other surface to write on, and she heard him in the doorway and finished the sentence she was on before she looked up. He sat down across from her without being invited. She'd noticed this was a pattern with him. He asked permission for almost nothing because asking permission was not a mode he'd ever been trained out of, and he wasn't conscious of it. "Calloway has enough," he said. "He'll have more once they pull the phone records and the email archive." Dalt's bag had a drive with copies of documents from that classified operation, the Danner operation, among others. He'd been trying to find a buyer for 14 months. And Voss? Federal investigation pending. The HR evidence, combined with the service entrance access code that traces to his credentials, combined with the email confirmation of the convoy schedule. He paused. The hospital board was notified at 4 p.m. He's been placed on administrative leave effective immediately. She nodded. That was how these things ended. Not dramatically, not cleanly, but in the language of institutional process, suspension and investigation and whatever came after. He would not be back. She knew that the way you knew things when enough weight had accumulated in one direction. "Garrett Danner," she said. "I spoke with him for 40 minutes. Whitfield's voice had changed, not softer, but slower, which was its own kind of change in a man who tended toward efficiency. "I told him what I could confirm about Marcus's operation. Not everything, but enough. Enough to make it real, to put his brother's name to something that was true." He paused. He needed it to be real more than he needed details. I think he'd been half afraid it was all a mistake. What happens to him now? Discharge from custody into a diversion program. First offense, no injuries, demonstrated mental health crisis. His legal representation is being arranged. A pause. I also connected him with the Survivor Family Liaison Office, not the general number. A specific person with a name who will call him back. She thought about Garrett Danner on the floor of a hospital corridor with his face in his hands, 22 years old and out of doors. She hoped the specific person with a name would actually call. She knew that hope was doing more work there than certainty could. "That's better than it was this morning," she said. "It is." He looked at her steadily. "Mara, I want to talk to you about something, and I want you to actually hear it rather than waiting for me to finish so you can tell me no." She put her pen down. "There's a joint initiative," he said, "military and civilian emergency medicine collaboration, the kind that develops cross-training protocols for rural trauma facilities. Places like this one, places that handle mass casualty situations without the resources that urban centers have. It needs a program coordinator, someone who understands both systems, someone who can actually talk to both sides without losing the thread." He paused. "The position has been open for 7 months because we have not been able to find the right person." She looked at him. "It doesn't require returning to active service," he said. "It's a civilian contract with a military partnership component. You would be based here, or wherever you chose to be based. You would build the curriculum. You would train the people." Another pause. "You would do what you did today, except with a framework around it instead of improvising in a hospital corridor." She was quiet for a moment. The office was small, and the light in it was the same buzzing fluorescent as the rest of the building, and outside the window the D'Urville evening was coming down gray and cool over the parking lot and the highway beyond it, and she sat with the question he'd asked, and let it be a real question instead of moving away from it. "I'd still work shifts here," she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question. "If you wanted to." "I'd want to." He almost smiled. The same almost smile from the corridor that morning, the one that never quite landed but was recognizable in the attempt. "I know." She looked at the pen she'd put down, picked it up again, set it on top of the chart. "I need to finish this documentation," she said, "and I need to check the board before the evening shift handoff, and then I'll think about it." "That's more than I expected," he said. He stood up. "I'll be here for 2 more hours. I'll find you before I leave." He went. She picked up the chart and looked at where she'd stopped and found the sentence and finished it. At 6:15, Reyes found her at the board and said without any of his usual careful neutrality, "There's something in the main corridor you need to see." His voice had that particular quality that wasn't quite excitement and wasn't quite discomfort, something in between. She followed him. The main corridor had people in it, not the medical kind of gathered, not triage or emergency, just people standing in the hallway with the specific self-consciousness of a group that had something to do and wasn't sure how to begin. She recognized most of them. Torres, 3 other residents, the unit clerk, 2 of the ER techs, 2 nurses from the med-surg floor who had come down from the 2nd level for reasons she hadn't been aware of. Deirdre, standing slightly to the side in the way Deirdre stood when she'd organized something and was now committed to watching it happen. Whitfield was there too, and Rourke and Keene. Mara stopped in the middle of the corridor and looked at the assembled faces and felt a kind of discomfort that was different from her usual discomfort, not the specific discomfort of Voss's comments or the compressed discomfort of carrying something alone, but something more exposed. Whitfield stepped forward. He had something in his hand, not a folder or a device, just a small flat case, the kind she recognized on sight. "This is not a formal ceremony," he said. He had the voice of someone who had given many formal ceremonies and was deliberately not giving one now. "We'll do that properly when we have time and the right people in the room, but I wasn't going to leave this building without saying something that should have been said a long time ago." She wanted to tell him this wasn't necessary. She didn't say it because it would have been deflection, and she was trying, lately, to be honest about the difference between modesty and avoidance. Mara Sutton served 7 years with Fleet Medical Surgical Unit in a deployment classification that doesn't appear in public records, Whitfield said. Not loudly, evenly, at a register that reached the whole corridor without performing. She was the senior medical officer for a Tier 1 element during 2 deployments. She performed field surgical intervention under direct fire on multiple occasions. She was decorated for an extraction under fire that saved 11 personnel. He paused. "She didn't tell you any of that. She came here and she did her job. She did it under conditions that would have broken a lot of people. She did it without asking for acknowledgement from anyone in this building." Another pause. "Today she managed a crisis, identified a threat, protected personnel, and helped bring 2 investigations to resolution, all while covering a regular nursing shift." The corridor was quiet. "The decoration is the Army Commendation Medal, reaffirmed classification review," he said. "It should have been presented properly years ago. I'm presenting it now because I was part of the reason it wasn't, and I think that matters." He looked at her. "Mara." She walked forward. She took the case when he held it out. She opened it, looked at the medal inside for a moment, not reading it, just seeing it, acknowledging the reality of it. And then she closed the case. She looked at the people in the corridor, Torres, who'd started leaving charts open on her side of the station when she needed to reference something, Reyes, who'd gone to the break room the day Voss had been particularly loud and left a coffee on the cart without saying anything, Deirdre, who had spent 6 years in an impossible position and had finally moved. She was not a person who made speeches. She knew this about herself. "I want to say something," she said, to the corridor generally, to no one specifically. "I've been in a lot of places that didn't work the way they were supposed to. Military, civilian, all of it. Institutions that were built to do one thing and spent their energy doing something else." She paused, finding the words not from preparation but from the place where things that were true lived before they were said. This hospital today is not the hospital I walked into 8 months ago. Not because of me, because of the people in it who made a different choice when they could have made an easier one. She looked at Deirdre directly. Some of those choices were harder than anything I did in this corridor today. Deirdre looked at the floor. Something moved across her face that she didn't let become anything specific. I'm not good at this part, Mara said, so I'm going to stop. There was a sound in the corridor, not applause exactly, the kind of aggregate sound people made when they'd been holding something and it released. Torres started it and Reyes joined and then most of them, and Mara stood in the middle of it and felt the discomfort and let it be there because some things were uncomfortable and worth it, and this was one of them. She found Kodiak at 7 p.m. Keen had the dog at the end of the east corridor, sitting against the baseboard in the position he'd been in since the Danner situation resolved, present, alert, watching the corridor traffic with the focused calm of an animal that had been trained to be useful and defaulted to readiness when there was nothing specific to be useful for. He saw her coming from 30 feet, and the low arc of his tail began, the same frantic movement from the lobby condensed now into something steadier. She sat down on the floor next to him, which was not something she ordinarily did in a hospital corridor, and he put his head in her lap with a weight that felt deliberate. She put her hand on the back of his neck. Keen was standing a polite distance away, giving them space in the manner of someone who had spent enough time around working dogs to know when they were communicating something that didn't need an audience. He's been like this all day, Keen said, since he found you. He remembers me, she said. I trained with his unit for 18 months before my last deployment. He was 8 months old. She ran her thumb behind his ear. I didn't know what happened to him after. He's been in garrison service for 2 years. He's good at the job, but Keen seemed to search for the word. He's been waiting for something. I didn't know what. Now I think I know what. She looked down at the dog. 7 years old now, still carrying the same attention in his eyes she'd seen when he was learning everything. She'd spent 1.5 years working beside this animal in conditions that didn't have official names, and both of them had come out the other side, separately, and found their way to a hospital in Montana, and that was not a thing she could make sense of, and also it made complete sense, and she had learned to hold both of those things. What happens to him, she said. Keen was quiet for a moment. That's actually, Colonel Whitfield asked me the same thing, about 20 minutes ago. Another pause. I think that's something you should talk to the colonel about. She didn't ask more. She stayed on the corridor floor with the dog's head in her lap until she needed to go back to the station for the evening handoff, and she sat in the specific piece of an animal that had found something it had stopped looking for, and she let herself stay in it without reaching for the next thing for once. The evening handoff took 20 minutes. She stayed an extra 40 because the incoming night nurse was new to the department, and the day had generated a significant quantity of paperwork that she hadn't finished, and she stayed because it was easier to stay than to leave, and she knew that about herself. That transition had always cost her more than most people could see. At 8:30, she found Whitfield in the parking lot, standing beside one of the SUVs in the particular end-of-day stillness of someone who has been running at high output and has finally come down to a lower register. The dog, she said. He's being remanded to you, he said. Effective when you want him. Keen already agreed. He said the animal has been directionless for 2 years, and he's done trying to be what Kodiak was looking for. He paused. The paperwork will take a week. She looked at the dark parking lot. The Derville Highway running north, the last edge of light over the ridge. The program, she said. The coordinator position. Yes? I'll do it. She said it before she finished deciding, which was unusual for her, but the decision had been made somewhere below the level she usually consulted, and she could feel it was already settled. On the terms we discussed, I write the curriculum, I build it from this end, from the civilian side, because that's what's missing from how the military thinks about rural trauma. She looked at him. And I keep my shifts here. He nodded. Done. I want Deirdre Okafor involved in the civilian protocol design. She knows this department, and she knows what gaps actually kill people as opposed to the theoretical gaps that look bad in reports. I'll support that. And I want someone to make sure Garrett Danner's liaison contact actually calls him. An actual follow-up, not a flag in a system. I'll personally make sure of it. She stood in the parking lot for another moment, looking at the highway. You asked me earlier what I was really doing here, she said. In Derville. You said you needed it to be small for a while. Yes. And I thought small meant safe. That if I kept the stakes visible, I could stay inside them. She paused. But the thing I didn't count on was that small places have the same problems that large places have, just with fewer people to hide them. And when you're the person who sees them, you can't actually choose not to. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You can't. I tried, she said. I know. That's why you're still good at this. He looked at her with the same directness he'd been using all day, the kind that had weight behind it. The people who've never tried to walk away are the ones you can't trust. They don't know what it costs. She didn't answer that, because it was true in a way that didn't need her agreement to be true. She went back inside. She did not walk into that hospital differently. That was the thing she would have said if anyone had asked about what changed and what didn't. She walked in the same way she always had, not slowly, not dramatically, the flat, efficient stride of someone who knew where she was going and what needed doing when she got there. Her badge still read the same name. The linoleum was still scuffed in the same places, but Deirdre looked up when she passed the station and said, without any overlay of any kind, "There's a coffee on the cart." And Mara said, "Thank you," and kept walking. And the exchange was small and ordinary and cost them nothing, and that was exactly what made it matter. Torres was finishing notes at the far end of the corridor and glanced up as she passed and nodded. A clean nod, peer to peer, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. She went and found the coffee and drank it standing at the window that looked out toward the parking lot, and in the cold glass she could see her own reflection very faintly. Middle-aged, tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing something real, the scar at her collar visible above the V of her scrubs, because she'd stopped pulling her collar up at some point in the last 12 hours and hadn't noticed. She left it where it was. The thing about being underestimated, the real thing, not the dramatic version, is that it doesn't end in a single moment of reversal. It ends gradually, in the accumulation of smaller moments where people begin to see something they'd been looking at all along. You don't get to control when it happens, or whether it happens in the right order. You don't get the clean version. You get the actual version, with its bad timing and its incomplete resolutions, and the one or two people who will never revise what they thought regardless of the evidence, because some people are committed to a fixed picture and no amount of truth reorganizes it. What you get, if you're fortunate, is enough. Enough people who saw the right things at the right time. Enough documentation, enough institutional memory in the form of a charge nurse who finally made a different call, a federal agent who showed up, a colonel who drove to a rural Montana hospital on a Tuesday and looked at the nurse everyone ignored and recognized what he was actually looking at, a dog who didn't forget. You get the work, which is the part that was always real regardless of what anyone said about it. You get the shift you show up for and the patient whose name you learn, and the moment in the corridor where you do the thing you know how to do because you've been doing it since before anyone here was aware you could. Mara finished the coffee, put the cup down, picked up the chart she'd left on the counter, and found the sentence she'd stopped at hours ago and finished it, filed the chart, pulled the next one. Outside, the Montana night was full dark and very cold and very large. And somewhere across the parking lot, Kodiak was sleeping in the back of an SUV waiting to see her in the morning. And somewhere in the hospital, Garrett Danner was waiting to hear his brother's name spoken by someone who had the authority to make it real. And somewhere in an administrator's office, a federal investigation was being notated in the careful language of institutions beginning to correct their own record. She picked up the next chart. She went back to work. That was all it had ever been. That was all it needed to be.